Chapter 4 Versatile Strategies. 1,000 Worlds Struggling to be Born. Ecosystems of Revolt. The struggles and initiatives described in the last chapter constitute a revolutionary wave that can be found in nearly every country across the world. The examples I've provided are just a tiny sample of an extensive web of obstruction, sabotage, demolition, healing, cultivation, creation, learning, and communication that represents the best hope for our planet. It is the only force currently in existence that meets all the following criteria: a structural independence from the bodies responsible for ecocide and colonizing capitalism, a capacity to force the state to back down in key conflicts, access to the locally specific knowledge necessary for real and intelligent responses to the unfolding climate catastrophe, a tendency to break through barriers and create an increasingly global consciousness that centers an awareness of the intersection of all forms of oppression and all the unfolding crises, access to traditions of organization and eco-social relation that open the possibility for a world without capitalism, without ecocide. Please do not mistake my glowing review for optimism. This is still a battle that pits David against Goliath, and if we were to approach the ecological crisis as though it were a wager in a casino, as the economists do, for example, then our money would be more wisely placed backing the forces of the apocalypse. However, if we wager our lives, they're on the line already, whether we've realized it yet or not. This motley network of underdogs is our best hope. All the other proposals for responding to the ecological crisis are some variation of the strategy which David becomes Goliath's shield-bearer, with the hope that, over time, Goliath will begin using his spear for good. What are the limitations of this revolutionary wave? The primary external limitation, as we have seen, is the counterinsurgency being waged against us. From moments of hard repression, all the people we've lost, all the people currently sitting in prison for their struggles, to the soft repression and invisibilization that mainstream environmental groups, media, and experts participate in, willingly or unwillingly. If at least some of those who are currently throwing their energies into redeeming Goliath were to sift their resources to supporting this revolutionary wave, which would also mean losing their considerable institutional privileges, then our chances would be considerably improved. There is a lack of a revolutionary imaginary, and a lack of consciousness that these different movements constitute seeds for future worlds. Basically, this means withdrawing our remaining faith in the dominant institutions and believing more in ourselves and the future we are trying to move towards. This is a limitation that is already being overcome within and between these movements themselves, and this book represents one small effort in that direction. It is, in other words, neither fatal nor insurmountable. There is a go-to mischaracterization that is used to dismiss the revolutionary potential of this wave, and it is very much an expression of the dominant institution's need to monopolize society-wide organization and problem-solving. It is the aspersion that these movements have no solution to offer that would be feasible on a relevant scale. To name one iteration, Holly Jean Buck characterizes the phenomenon Naomi Klein names as blockadia as reactive. I won't go into whether this dismissal is the result of a misreading by Buck, or of the limited view Klein utilizes to present blockadia as more palatable, begging the question, palatable to whom? I will offer the observation, though, that experts are trained to silence their subject of study, so it does seem both systematic and symptomatic that, in looking at such a rich phenomenon, ranging from the resistance at Standing Rock to Hambach Forest, one would see something reactive. In any case, the broader, more global, less respectable view of the resistance that I have tried to present makes it clear that we are dealing with something intelligent, creative, strategic, proactive, and with a whole hell of a lot of proposals that will not be silenced. The movements and projects that form this global web are marked with their heterogeneity, heterodoxy, and plain ornery refusal to be easily categorized. I do not think this many-headed hydra of resistance should be named. After all, a bean with 1,000 heads would come up with 1,000 different names for itself. However, I do want to name common characteristics in the most flexible way possible, to encourage what I see as strengths, and to aid more people in transforming their own activities so as to be able to connect rhizomatically with this greater whole. The following characteristics are not bounded containers that can govern inclusion or exclusion in a delimited phenomenon. Rather, they are tensions that vibrate throughout the entire web. Territoriality. A relationship with specific local territory constitutes a main source of power for these struggles and projects. We develop our practices and histories in dialogue with the territory, such that the environment is neither inert surroundings nor a neutral field on which to impose an ideology that is the same from place to place. Rooting struggles in a specific territory walks a line between two forms of isolation. In nearly every struggle, there will be people who limit themselves to their territory, who do not look for common ground with other struggles, or seek inspiration from their own experiences that could have a wider, perhaps global significance. And on the other hand, there are those who are alienated from any territory, even as they participate in local activism. They draw ideological lines for solidarity. Either they restrict solidarity to their own small sect, or they read the values of their sect into all of those with whom they would like to solidarize. Such people are part of the mix, and this is a complication in territorial struggles, but also a form of openness, presenting the possibility to weave in a wider body of people. Ecocentrism. While many of those who constitute this revolutionary wave prioritize human needs, we tend to reject the pretension that human needs can substantially contradict, outrank, or detach themselves from ecological needs. And at one level or another, we challenge or reject definitions of humanity stemming from the European Enlightenment and human/nature dichotomies. Survival. We articulate our activity in relation to situations that directly affect us, and we center this struggle as a question of survival, our own and that of other people and forms of life we care about. Having a voice, therefore, does not come down to expertise or institutional legitimacy, but to being affected and personally engaging with the problems and its solutions. Lawlessness. To a greater or lesser degree, these projects enter into conflict with established legal regimes. They may actively seek the subversion and destruction of existing governments. They may claim traditional and indigenous systems of law that pragmatically have nothing in common with punitive or property-based law originating in states. Or they may seek as much as possible to pass unnoticed or mold themselves into existing legal regimes, but they will always value the needs of their community and the needs of the earth more than the authority of the government, or the ostensible sanctity of its law. Communal being. Individualized or atomized views of human beings are eroded in favor of practices that emphasize and revitalize relationships between people, sometimes including relationships that break down the division between humans and other forms of life. There is always an element of struggle against the alienations imposed by states and capitalism, and a tendency to practice mutual aid and solidarity. This means that this web of resistance is fundamentally creative, of different social relations, different subjectivities, and emancipatory infrastructures, practices, and cultures. Heterogeneity. As mentioned, this movement of movements, to use the Zapatistas' terms, is extremely heterogeneous. This does not mean simply diverse, but that it is constantly producing differences, and that it will not submit to ideological or cultural unity. This salient feature makes any technocratic proposal for solving the crisis extremely ignorant, which is probably why technocrats tend to ignore or selectively silence movements that already exist when designing solutions. It should be noted that this heterogeneity is not just a cultural preference of the network. It is an inalienable feature of the network's territorialized nature. This is why ideologies, or named traditions of struggle, that are structurally capable of assuming diversity rather than unity of practice, such as Zapatismo or anarchism, would never be able to absorb all the iterations of this revolutionary wave. The only reason these traditions of struggle are tolerated and encouraged throughout much of the network is precisely because they have no ideological need to convert others to their way of thinking or to achieve theoretical unity. Intersectionality. The movements that participate in this wave tend to break down single-issue containers and instead recognize the interconnectedness of different forms of oppression and, therefore, solidarity. This intersectionality allows us to recognize one another, even though we come from very different places and lack uniform identifiers. The process of recognition, it should be noted, is conflictual rather than pacifying. People often fight to get recognized on their own terms. A struggle that has not been made easier by the ways in which we have been differently socialized within oppressive systems. Meaning, the self-definition of struggles is crucial to the possibility of solidarity across the network. People are implicitly trusted to define their own oppressions and lead their own struggles. This is another death blow to any pretensions of imposing uniform solutions. Anti-colonialism. All of these initiatives and movements exist in contradiction to the project of development, which is the most active manifestation of colonialism in the age of the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and all the attendant NGOs. Beyond this common negation, there is a great deal of distance between fully anti-colonial movements that identify capitalism as the enemy without exploring colonization as a historical and ongoing process integral to the globalization of capitalism, and even movements that use the language of development in a bid to access resources or legitimacy. Even among the former currents, there are very different experiences of colonialism across the world, but the heterogeneity of the resistance means those differences do not have to present a problem. I would argue that, despite the broad differences in language and scope, these movements' practices open up possibilities for complementarity, and that an expansive anti-colonial consciousness is a priority for increasing their potency. In a use of these terms that is far from universal, I think it would be useful to make a distinction between decolonial and anti-colonial. The latest buzzword, decolonial, is now frequently used in academic and activist texts that make no mention of the restoration of indigenous lands and don't even have the decency to so much as hint at the possibility of abolishing settler states that owe their existence to colonialism, like the United States or Canada. What exactly is decolonization supposed to mean if the fruits and vehicles of colonialism are grandfathered in and accepted as eternal? The distinction I would make is between movements that seek reconciliation and disarmament and those that seek to destroy forces that have been accepted as universal. These latter movements hold out hope for a victory that will undo some of the defeats of the past 500 years, or 2,000 years, or longer, depending on the territory we are looking at. Autonomy. People who constitute this international network may be actively trying to subvert and destroy the state, or they may be looking for some breathing room from state repression in which to carry out their activities. Some may even support an alternative government that may reduce the degree of repression. We may believe that the contest with the state is central to our struggle, or that the state will disappear if the people gain some form of economic self-sufficiency. We may reject any contact with the state, or we may try to win access to government resources. Whatever the case, a general practice of autonomy is what allows us to work together and to form cohesive networks of resistance. Autonomy means we write our own rules. We make our own decisions independently of oversight by any party or government. Whatever the provenance of our resources, we make the final decisions about how those resources are used, and we practice self-organization and avoid the centralization of the movement. If one element of these movements maintains a relationship with a political party or government, they take care not to let that relationship condition their activity in the movement or convert them into a lever by which the government and party can exert influence over the movement. If they fail to uphold either of these minimums, it is widely seen as a breach of solidarity by the rest of the movement. Without autonomy, it is impossible to create a movement of movements, a world in which 1,000 worlds can flourish. These last two characteristics especially, anti-colonialism and autonomy, are the sites of crucial strategic debates. I am very much a partisan in these debates, and I firmly believe that spreading the practices of anti-colonialism and autonomy, more or less as I have described them, but certainly without any doctrinaire consensus, is vital to improving the revolutionary potential of our interconnected movements. The framework of autonomy enjoys a special advantage. It offers the default political compass in peasant struggles and indigenous struggles, as well as urban squatting and countercultural movements. The 2006 Oaxaca rebellion that created a large pocket of stateless self-organization for 5 months throughout a large part of the southern Mexican state drew heavily on indigenous traditions for their organizational structures. In the framework of federated assemblies, labor organizers and peasants, indigenous peoples and mestizos, peasants and city dwellers, anarchists and Marxists, could all work together. It has become increasingly common for famous writers and green academics to give a nod to social movements by claiming that they are a necessary adjunct to political change. This allows them to acknowledge that the dominant political institutions have a terrible track record when it comes to solving social and ecological problems, without being so radical as to identify those political institutions as one of the sources of the problem. However, they diplomatically avoid any historical analysis of how the relationship between states and social movements always ends up. In her best-selling book in favor of the Green New Deal, On Fire, Naomi Klein reproduces a speech she gave to the UK Labour Party in 2017 while Jeremy Corbyn was leader. In this speech, she urges for a strong relationship between the party and the social movements, claiming that social movements, quote, have a huge amount to gain from engaging with electoral politics, unquote, though she is remarkably short on details. We didn't have to wait long to see how poorly that wager panned out. Corbyn's own party sabotaged the progressive agenda, ensuring that the only electoral options for the public would be to the right and the center. Though I am an anarchist, I've never held a dogmatic position against voting. What is most important is what you do with all the other thousands of hours in the year. The reason I now caution people against engaging with electoral politics is that I've seen the consequences, a clear pattern from the Corbyn campaign in the UK to the Sanders campaign in the US to austerity referendum in Greece to the independence referendum in Catalonia, to the MAS victory in Bolivia, to the constitutional referendum in Chile. Aside from the immense energies and resources wasted in these campaigns to sway a vote rather than to build infrastructures for communities in struggle, there is a clear psychological result. Every single time, when they lost, and even more so if they won, resilient movements that supported these electoral campaigns with a justification of urgency or gradual change became jaded, burnt out, and demoralized in the aftermath. It is as though the symbolic act of voting carries a very real psychological weight, as though we were depositing our hopes in a machine that will inevitably disappoint us. Political parties are unscrupulous in how they will cannibalize social movements and suck them dry. Even in countries where political engagement is most easy to justify on grounds of mere survival, for example, where the old government has direct ties to the military and death squads, alliance with a more progressive government constitutes a dead end, with initial improvements giving way, the pendulum swinging back to old, bloody habits in a matter of years. The truce is at best a temporary affair. Context is more important than dogma, and people's survival is paramount. Those who live in a situation where their very survival is threatened shouldn't have to worry about the uninformed disapproval of those for whom the danger is less urgent. But they also shouldn't have any illusions about the inevitable trajectory of state power. This is why building autonomous power and understanding that all the institutions of colonial society endanger us is so important. False pragmatisms. Strategies of desperation. Lake Leoleo, located in the Biobío region of southern South America, is one of the cleanest lakes on the entire continent. Located in the heart of Wallmapu, the Mapuche country occupied by the Chilean and Argentinian states since the end of the 19th century, Leoleo stays clean thanks to the concerted action of the Mapuche communities that surround it. When Winca, or colonizer companies, start building cabins to attract tourists, and in their wake the promise of jet skis, vehicle traffic, and the sheen of oil and suntan lotion atop the water, Mapuche warriors burn those cabins down. When the Carabineros, Chilean military police, build outposts in the region to protect business ventures from arson or to guard the extensive forestry plantations from Mapuche land reclamation actions, they get burned down too. When mining companies come into the region to prospect, their surveying stakes get removed and their vehicles get destroyed. When the state tries to crack down on this resistance, the communities block all the highways in the region and organize combative protests in the nearby city of Concepcion or the Chilean capital Santiago. This ongoing victory is a microcosm in which we can tease out the deficiencies of the major proposals for solving the ecological crisis coming from the left. Staying within the bounds of the law or setting the limit at respectable and symbolic civil disobedience is simply unrealistic. In any territory where inhabitants are not collecting the wages of whiteness, there is no clean water without arson, blockades, and clandestine organization. The Mapuche struggle around Leoleo also belies the idea of decolonization as just a polite word tacked onto the end of a policy proposal that relies on the very institutions of coloniality to solve the problem. In real practice, it means physically and forcefully taking land back, incurring tremendous risks, and entering into conflict with all the institutions of dominant society. Their successes are also a warning against climate reductionism. Without even a moderately technocratic gaze focused on statistics of carbon reduction, Mapuche communities actually become the enemies of the climate, and further repressive action against them can be justified within environmental logic. As we have seen, a part of the Mapuche struggle involves destroying commercial forestry plantations, the very plantations that, from a global technocratic view, count as vital carbon sinks, and a major part of the Chilean government's strategy to become a celebrated carbon-neutral country. Only with an intensely local perspective can we see that the plantations are not forests, and they are actually destroying the land and depleting the water. Once we abandon the technocrat's office and adopt that local perspective, other issues become as important, if not more important, than statistics on atmospheric carbon. Defending a sacred lake, restoring specifically native forests, and fighting for food sovereignty. None of these goals are prioritized by the climate movement in the global north, but in fact they represent a path of struggle that is far more able to address the ecological crisis, including global warming, than a reductionist approach. The civil disobedience movement, Extinction Rebellion, suffers from climate reductionism in multiple ways. By making almost no reference to the long and diverse history of ecological struggles, it is cutting itself off from the collective learning experiences that infuse our histories of resistance. As I have pointed out elsewhere, historical amnesia is a key feature of nonviolent movements, especially in the last 20 years. By not engaging with the lived histories of struggles and the lessons they present, nonviolent movements shelter themselves from the radical and strategic evolution that tends to disavow a dogmatic nonviolence. They also avoid deep analysis of the social situation they face, which protects them from having to study, for example, the repressive mechanisms of the state, or how nonviolence in social movements is a key objective of counterinsurgency strategies. In the case of Extinction Rebellion, they substitute movement histories with statistics promising the success of nonviolent civil disobedience. The statistics, incidentally, come from a study that compares a hand-picked list of ostensible pacifist victories with a database of bloody military conflicts, intentionally leaves out movements that demonstrate the effectiveness of a diversity of tactics, fails to define victory, frequently misrepresents its own results, and was authored in part by a former employee of the U.S. State Department and Defense Department. Needless to say, the statistics were spread widely by corporate media. The political naivety of Extinction Rebellion extends from their methods to their goals, namely the idea of pressuring governments to declare climate emergencies and to support the Paris Agreement. The declaration of a climate emergency is meaningless in policy terms. It is a public relations Christmas for governments on the right and the left, a way for them to clean up their image with another hollow declaration. As for the Paris Agreement, we have seen how inadequate it is. Subsequent action goals, like money strikes, also tend to be weak on their own, as well as exclusive to those who have money. And the creation of citizens' assemblies, with actual decision-making power, would require major constitutional reforms, an outcome that hasn't been achieved by peaceful movements. But again, the proposal is easy to co-opt, as governments love consultative bodies with no real power as a way to institutionalize and neutralize demands. Looking at the movement with the very urgency they call for, it seems like Extinction Rebellion is using up an immense amount of resources and the energies of tens of thousands of young people in order to lobby for a few buckets on board the Titanic. But it is worse than a question of inefficiency. Extinction Rebellion's insistence on a single-issue focus. They have been frequently criticized for apathy to environmental racism and the marginalization of racialized people and struggles, fails monumentally to address the central question of colonialism and opens the door to eco-fascism. The possibility for a renewed alliance between ecology and white supremacy was established at a critical juncture of the environmental movement in the last century. In the 1960s, environmental consciousness was expanding, manifesting in the works of Murray Bookchin, Rachel Carson, and Vina Deloria Jr. During this period, Indigenous struggles achieved global attention, and movements against imperialist wars, including support for the rights of refugees, also blossomed. People could have chosen an integral consciousness that saw the connections between these different struggles, but one sector gravitated towards the defense of an anti-human environment at the exclusion of all other issues, perhaps lured by the donations of the old conservationist aristocracy. Thanks to their unsolidaristic exclusions, we can talk about environmentalism as a white supremacist phenomenon of most interest to the progressive whites, but equally useful to fascists of the blood and soil variety who mimic the German Nazi Party's cooptation of the early 20th century back to the land movements. Not only has this alliance sullied a large part of the animal rights movement that made inroads into the climate movement, it has leapt to the international stage, as when the Austrian Green Party formed a ruling coalition in 2020 with a highly xenophobic OVP, or Australian Volks Party, who had previously ruled with literal neo-Nazis of the Freedom Party. It remains to be seen whether Extinction Rebellion will have staying power, or whether it will disappear like the other astroturfed movements before it. Whatever the case, the strategy of lobbying the government for emergency measures will remain dominant as long as there exists a capitalist media to redirect all social conflicts into dialogue with the institutions of power. The Green New Deal is the main proposal on the left, and in a social democratic framework it makes a lot of sense. It directs massive public spending to pay for a total infrastructure overhaul, completing the transition to renewable energy, while also increasing social spending to ameliorate the inequalities that have provoked growing crises in nearly all of the world's democracies. At the same time, the government-subsidized production may be enough to trigger a new industrial expansion and leave behind the crisis of accumulation global capitalism has been dragging in its wake since 2007, and in some senses, since the 1970s. In a stroke, the Green New Deal could resolve the three interconnected crises that threaten the state: the ecological crisis, democracy's crisis of legitimacy, and capitalism's crisis of accumulation. In truth, the Green New Deal should be catechism for the most ardent defenders of the current system, toppling as it is. But it seems that nearly everyone is one long step behind events. Conservatives, locked in their perpetual existential crisis, are too threatened by the updating of their privileges that they are further destabilizing the system they are trying to protect, as always. Centrists are trying to preserve a middle ground where there is none. And so it has fallen on progressives, many of them avowed anti-capitalists, to become capitalism's last line of defense. Economists have largely acknowledged that the current model of permanent deficit spending by governments is in fact feasible, with governments always spending beyond their budgets. However, it is only possible to avoid major defaults and economic collapse if governments continue to service interest payments, which they can only do if their economies keep growing, giving them a higher GDP and higher incomes year after year. The massive expenditures of the Green New Deal require an increase in deficit spending, which in turn requires a constant increase in the overall volume of the economy. Any Green New Deal would mean giving up on any hopes of degrowth in favor of the dubious proposition that infinite economic growth can in fact be healthy and sustainable on a finite planet. Some have tried to revive this pipe dream by conjuring up a slanted portrayal of the information economy, suggesting that its processes are creative, effective, and ethereal, therefore not dependent on material extraction. The Bitcoin boom, with appropriately named Bitcoin miners now using more energy than many mid-sized countries, should put to rest any doubts that capitalism is always fundamentally extractive. All value chains eventually come back to killing ecosystems and selling the corpses. Despite promises of spending for social justice programs, the Green New Deal remains climate reductionist. It will increase the amount of destruction caused by so-called green energies by several orders of magnitude, add new devastating infrastructures for carbon capture and storage, and spur wars and coups for copper, lithium, and cobalt. And it will create a multi-trillion-dollar market for land. That's carbon sinks, sites for wind and photovoltaic production, biofuels, and that will be the death knell for small farmers, peasants, and indigenous communities the world over. By richly incentivizing carbon sinks, world governments and NGOs are laying the groundwork for a massive land grab that is set to match the scale of the invasions and colonization of the 16th to 18th centuries. Expanding the market for carbon, whether through tax credits or major government subsidies, will be a huge boon to the logging industry, to energy companies, and to agribusiness, as remaining agricultural lands will have to shift towards more intensive, infrastructure-heavy, market-oriented production. It is easy to see why Wall Street and the luminaries of big business tend to be tepidly in favor of the Green New Deal or similar proposals. The Green New Deal means a massive amount of government funding and tax credits, and companies like Microsoft, Tesla, Google, and forward-thinking oil companies like BP are the best positioned to capture that money. The main point of reticence is that the Green New Deal would increase government intervention and control over the economy, just as the original New Deal constituted a transfer of, quote, control over world liquidity from London and Wall Street to Washington, in the words of Giovanni Arrighi. Nearly all the projects we looked at in Chapter 3 are short on resources. All of them can use more support, but none of them are calling for billions of dollars of infusions in government money, precisely because they know that would destroy them. Monetizing the cracks in the system where they have been able to thrive, bringing in major corporations eager to profit off human and ecosystem services, and in the global south, increasing the funding for paramilitary death squads far beyond what the drug and logging industries were ever able to provide. A reference to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal that pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression, the Green New Deal, set itself up for an illuminating and accurate historical comparison. The original New Deal brought to bear immense government resources to stimulate the economy and create employment. It is often associated with the beginning of Keynesian economics, governments running deficits to actively intervene in the economy in coordination with a central bank. Though the Green New Deal is lionized by progressives, it presents a curious illusion for the environmental movement, given how it was exemplified by the construction of megaprojects like hydroelectric dams that displaced tens of thousands of small farmers and destroyed entire river valleys, or more than 1 million kilometers of roads and highways that scarred the land and constituted an infrastructural handout to the automobile industry that would come to dominate the architecture of American life, as well as becoming a principal source of air pollution. True, the New Deal also included reforestation and soil conservation efforts in response to the Dust Bowl. However, government aid was designed not to restore the health of the land, but to continue commercial agriculture. The Dust Bowl only ended when rainfall patterns returned to normal in the region, and while soil conservation improved, other ecocidal practices continued, as evidenced by ongoing desertification today, as well as the dead zone in the Mississippi River Delta. The New Deal has a sheen of social justice due to a few programs that challenged oppressive inequalities. The Federal Writers Project, for example, paid writers to restore oral histories of certain populations, most famously documenting the memories of thousands of elderly black people, the survivors of the last generation to live through slavery. While there is a clear value in such projects of historical memory, the Federal Writers Project manifested and reinforced the very inequalities that were being addressed, as typically occurs when governments throw money at a problem of social justice. Most of the writers getting government checks to survive the extreme misery of the Depression and record the memories of slavery's last survivors were not black, but Southern whites, many of them from families who had profited off of slavery and off of the sharecropping that followed it. Even Naomi Klein, in her book in favor of the Green New Deal, acknowledges that the original New Deal was deployed because it, quote, appeared at the time to be the only way to hold back a full-scale revolution, unquote. It provided the handouts and the funding to weaken or institutionalize social movements, getting them under control, and within the framework of well-paid, institutionalized labor unions and full employment underwritten by the government, It replaced the revolutionary internationalism of the workers' movement, a movement that launched mutinies throughout World War I and countless general strikes, insurrections, and revolutions at the war's end, with the narrowed horizons of patriotism. The New Deal set the stage for the weakness of revolutionary movements after World War II, for the nationalism and conservatism of the Cold War, and all the assaults on workers' rights and social justice that entailed. Historically, social democracy has always planted the seed of its own destruction. That's exactly what the Green New Deal does. It prevents a real solution. It kills off our best chance for a better world in order to save capitalism, to kick the can down the road, or more realistically, into the laps of the people who will bear the brunt of this new industrial onslaught. The Green New Deal is colonialism as usual. Asad Rehman calls it green colonialism and points out that the green energy transition of the Green New Deal is reliant on the same economic structures that have caused the problem. He also underscores the danger of the mining boom a green transition would require. Resource extraction is responsible for 50% of global emissions, as well as a great deal of violence against poor communities, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Chile, he says. Quote, "At the heart of our economic system, fueled by the City of London, is a belief that the UK and other rich countries are entitled to a greater share of the world's finite resources, irrespective of who we impoverish in doing so, or the destruction we cause. This green colonialism will be delivered by the very same entrenched economic interests who have willingly sacrificed both people and the climate in the pursuit of profit. But this time the mining giants and dirty energy companies will be waving the flag of climate emergency to justify the same deathly business model." Unquote. By trying to capture the existing channels for economic action on a global scale, the Green New Deal will inevitably plug into the institutional pathways and Eurocentric framework of development, a thinking and practice that has been roundly criticized as racist. As Rajni Kothari put it, where colonialism left off, development took over. Massive funding for green energy and industrial-scaled carbon sinks is already producing an outsized impact on the global south. In Mozambique, consistent with other African contexts, expanding as a direct result of European governments' renewable energy targets, legitimizes and greenwashes acts of land grabbing to the detriment of some of the most marginalized in society, causing entire communities to be displaced, leading to food insecurity, resource deprivation, social polarization, and political instability, and constituting vast spiritual and cultural loss. Good intentions are about as widespread as bad results. The pervasive racism in the development paradigm of the existing institutional pathways for directing global interventions is too systemic for this blunt instrument to be corrected with more liberal application of decolonialization rhetoric. Some authors and organizers do take these tendencies into account, and they offer proposals for a Green New Deal that would make sure money directly reached those most in need, that it would be used to empower communities and overcome the legacies of racism and colonialism without funding the hyper-exploitative markets I have warned about. The problem with these proposals is that they read like a wish list for an ideal world. They do not come with examples of government programs that have ever achieved similar results in the past. If the Green New Deal were actually carried out in such a way, it would strip the very people who make up the government of their wealth and power. Even stable democracies like the United States and the United Kingdom would see a military coup before those who hold power would allow a policy one half as radical to be legislated. Nowhere is there a government with more than a tiny handful of representatives willing to propose such policies. Another proposed response to the ecological crisis is eco-Leninism, or war communism, for the climate crisis. Some iterations of this proposal focus on the method. creating a vanguard cadre organization to lead the climate movement. And others focus on the finality, strong governments that will ruthlessly use their regulatory and punitive powers to get their houses in order. In terms of substance, this proposal is little more than tough talk. It does pose a danger, though, because if the past is any guide, and it usually is, authoritarian and vanguardist formations can grow quickly when the dominant institutions are facing collapse. Their destiny is usually to make some kind of alliance with those in power, either to betray, institutionalize, and repress revolutionary movements, or to create a new system with many components of the old one, and all the oppressive baggage they drag with them. The comparison to war communism can be attributed to Andreas Malm. Like the Green New Deal, it seems a poorly thought out historical illusion. The USSR was a fully ecocidal regime. As a revolutionary experiment, it left the most interesting questions unanswered. How much might we have learned from urban Soviets and factory councils creating direct relationships with rural councils of peasants and food producers during the Russian Revolution? Lenin prohibited this direct self-organization by the proletariat between November and December of 1917. How much might we have learned from Alexander Chayanov, the author of Peasant Farm Organization, and a proponent of small-scale cooperative farming as opposed to large-scale state-run farms? He was executed on Stalin's orders in October 1937. As for war communism, that was nothing but a bald euphemism used to describe the Red Army's bloody plunder of the countryside to keep alive two primary instruments of Bolshevik power during the Civil War, the army itself and the urban party bureaucrats. War communism was substantially identical to what an army will do when it doesn't have supply lines to a productive and stable hinterland. It corresponded not to any vision of social transformation, but to the interests and power struggles of the moment. How are we to interpret this as a proposal that states today might carry out? What state will use its regulatory powers so ruthlessly, not in its own interests, but against its own economic elite? And what major states even have a vanguard party remotely close to being able to grow over the next few years, take over, and implement this war communism against polluters? The proposal is completely out of touch with the social movements that actually exist today, the movements that comprise the only force for change not beholden to the economic and political interests destroying the planet. The movements behind nearly all the major revolts since the collapse of the USSR share several emergent characteristics. Multitudinous actions largely at the margins of all formal organizations, a skepticism towards dialogue with existing institutions, and instead a tendency to disrupt their managerial dominance. A revolutionary organizational framework that is specifically anti-vanguardist, that seeks to create spaces of dialogue across social movements rather than controlling such movements, and that breaks with the statist practice of subsuming revolution to a military contest, and an emphasis on assembly-based decision-making structures, frequently traditional and indigenous in origin, as more legitimate and more liberatory than state structures. Even historically Leninist movements from Venezuela to Kurdistan have been shifting to more autonomous frameworks. The social movements that exist today are not building the kinds of power that would be useful to the project of taking over the state. And that is very good news. Since the post-war demassification of the proletarian and the growing strength of anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-patriarchal structures have multiplied the lines of struggle, homogenizing organizations like parties have not been able to express the aspirations of social movements. They have tended towards insulary and social conservatism, or they have taken advantage of sudden booms to make inspiring promises, forestall their inevitable collapse, and rush into the halls of power institutionalizing as much of the social movement as they can, and gaining access to government funding and more opaque forms of financing as the only way to stay alive. I think the major reason such unrealistic proposals, all coming down to trusting the government to solve things, have been flourishing, is desperation. We feel weak. Millions of people are dying. Millions of species are threatened with extinction right now, and every year emissions only increase. The point of no return might already have slipped by. Our movements are not as strong as they need to be, and so it seems that the best hope is for someone to wave a magic wand and make things better. We certainly don't have any magic wands, but from down here, it seems like the government might. The protections governments offer are often illusory. They have a perfectly abysmal track record for honoring their emissions targets, their biodiversity targets, their treaties. Ashley Dawson's book, Extreme Cities, is full of examples of how major cities, from Miami to New York, faced with the existential threat that they will very soon be underwater, have wasted decades with bureaucratical regulations that are little more than evasions. So how will government regulation be transformed into a machine efficient enough to hang our lives on? This seems to be the crucial strategic question for those who pin their hopes on the state. How do you make the state function differently to how it has always functioned? Where are the models from the past that show states work effectively to protect their people, all their people, and their environments without resorting to some kind of resource imperialism? Occasionally, we can find vague suggestions that social movements will force governments to stay the course. So if social movements are the key component for resolving the climate crisis, why don't all the books that advocate a Green New Deal or a robust regulatory state give social movements a voice and make social movements the protagonists of their story, sharing their specific experiences, methodologies, and proposals? Why don't they present us with histories of social movements and governments achieving fruitful collaborations? They do not because they cannot. Because the more they propose governmental solutions to our problems, the more distant and deafened they are to the movements. And because the history of our movements show that the relationship with governments, on balance, is an antagonistic one. Governments are machines designed to allow the upper class to exert pressure on the rest of society. They do not work the other way around. They are about as reversible as a telescope. They limit the horizons of possibility rather than expanding them. Nor is it sensible to place our faith in progressive or revolutionary governments, because even these remain part of an interlocking global system they cannot simply wish away. To fund social programs and import food, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela had to encourage oil extraction to generate foreign revenue, leading to violent conflicts with indigenous communities whose lands are degraded by oil production. Nonetheless, cheerleaders of the global north are easy to fool. In Tiquipaya, Bolivia, in 2010, when Evo Morales hosted the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights to Mother Earth, his administration merely had to hide all the sawmills on the road leading to the conference site with billboards, confident none of the international attendants would speak with locals or inquire after ongoing deforestation. A few years later, he mobilized his union supporters to attack indigenous marchers with dynamite as they protested the construction of a major highway through the territory, exposing the western Amazon to a development boom. It was the kind of megaproject the earlier right-wing government would have never been able to get away with. In fact, it benefited from the superficial anti-imperialism spread by the populist left that reduces everything to puppeteering by the U.S. government, ignoring how capitalism actually implants itself in every territory it touches. While the devastation was carried out by Bolivian companies and Brazilian capital, its opponents were denounced as agents of the CIA, culminating in the aforementioned attack as well as an anti-terrorism campaign against local anarchists. Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui characterizes the Morales government as craving centralized power and putting an Indian face to corporate capitalism. Across the political spectrum, governmental environmentalism endangers us. It does not make us safer. As environmental inputs and outputs are increasingly monetized, subjected to rational measurement, we draw ever closer to the dystopia of a technocratic control of the environment, which will also translate into more technocratic control of humanity. Neither is this an overly paranoid vision. Smart city plans systematically bond green proposals with increased AI-based surveillance, and MI5 was recently caught funding research on agricultural drones that also doubled for rural surveillance. Reflecting the class interests and the worldview of the technocrats themselves, all of these proposals enact power as a lever that operates on inert others. To them, the territory is a map, and theirs is the hand that holds the pencil that will redraw it. Deep down, they can never trust the intelligence of the territory, nor locate themselves within it. They cannot surrender themselves to the dialogue, the dance, with a specific territory, nor meld into the reciprocal relationship that is the earth healing itself. Modern-day missionaries, they fail to accept that they are not needed to save anyone, and that is why they remain a part of the problem. To quote Erasto Felicio again, of Tea dos Povos, those who have not yet territorialized and organized their community cannot lead a fight for land and territory. Since I am an anarchist, it would be easy for many of those whose proposals I am criticizing to chalk up my rejection of the state to a merely ideological position. For me, though, anarchism does not mean converting everyone to my way of thinking. It is a methodology for building a world in which 1,000 worlds can fit. The proposal that heterogeneous social movements require autonomy from the state in order to work together would be rather limited if only fellow anarchists saw the benefits of such autonomy. So I spoke with someone who, like me, prioritizes ecological struggle and rejects the colonial project, but who has a very different political background. In Chapter 2, Adriana Cuena described the interrelated problems of expertise and whiteness. We also learned about her experiences in the Chavista movement in Venezuela, where she was a part of numerous initiatives that sought government resources or collaborated in some way with the government. Often this was a way to win some breathing room after the brutal right-wing governments of the past and the ongoing violence of the U.S. and Colombian-backed economic elite that still holds a great deal of power in Venezuela. A stranglehold, it might be noted, that Chavez was unable to break and that in some cases has intensified. Calculations of urgency make sense in this context. Quote, "For us, climate collapse already began some years ago." Unquote. Even though we differ on the proposition of a revolutionary government, it is heartening that we come to many of the same conclusions regarding the tendencies of governmental action and the need for social movements to cultivate their autonomy. A key figure that took on a central importance in our conversations was the technocratic gaze, how it constitutes a continuation of colonialism, maintains its hold even on revolutionary governments, and is fatal to any lasting solution for the ecological crisis. Quote, "At one extreme we have the philanthropy of foreign NGOs. For example, I can briefly describe the case in which the French oil company, Total, as part of its greenwashing policies, had the great idea of installing solar panels in the Amacuro Delta in Venezuela so that some Warayo communities could have access to electricity. In this case, a concrete need such as being able to charge mobile phones, provide lighting for schools, run a television for the families gathered around to watch kung fu movies, run a refrigerator, is satisfied through an experience in renewable energy. But going over the heads of the communitarian and indigenous logics of authority, decision-making, and management of resources, and then afterwards never taking care of the maintenance and leaving the Warayo territory in an absolute mess, full of trashed panels, renewable in name only, and with various intra-community conflicts. Another failed attempt by the modern technocratic paratrooper method, or paracaidismo, a rather visual metaphor for the experts who parachute out of an airplane with no idea where they'll land. On the other end, we have the governmental institution that sends a technician to try and resolve a local agricultural problem, for example, with a solution straight out of an agronomy manual that is nothing but propaganda for the poorly named Green Revolution. They worry about output, as though it were an isolated affair. They are obsessed with the quantitative, because that is what they can write up in their spreadsheet. They are concerned with their technological packet, seeds, agrotoxins, machinery, sold to them by a provider, almost always a foreign company, who is already entered into the ledgers. They don't have the capacity to dialogue with that which already exists. They don't see the potential in an agro-ecosystem beyond what is written in their manual from the Netherlands or Canada. Their recipe requires bringing in almost everything from the outside, sweeping away that which already exists, forgetting local knowledge, the comprehension of the relations that already exist there. Ignore the spiritual dimension, of course, and convert everything into a neutral substrate so as to begin from zero, like in the laboratory. This subject, whitened, modern, and technified, does not listen, and with his design he degrades. And if, as in this case, he is a representative of the state, vested with the authority of the very institutionality that measures your access to basic rights, it's even more difficult. It is always a matter of whiteness and specialization. There is this myth that the territory can always be controlled and domesticated. Maybe in territories where domestication and the imperial logic have been established for thousands of years, like large parts of Europe, this can make sense. But in many of the places that are today known as the Americas, the history is different. The dialogue with the territory, and with all the beings that inhabit it, has not been one of domestication by control and subjugation, but rather of coexistence and symbiosis. If we root the topic of quality and sustainability in more political dimensions connected to the climate, we can see how, in Venezuela, the merely quantitative and homogenizing logic of the technocracy obstructed the development of popular power, which is power that is territorialized from below. The diversification of the economy, the redesigning of education, and the most opportune moment for all those things, which was during the government of Hugo Chavez. This transformed the self-perception people had of their own agency and generated the construction of a new local political class that, because it can speak the language of the institutions, it can adapt its mentality to these quantitative approximations, a reductionism of goals, objectives, number of beneficiaries, zeros and commas, accumulated privileges and ignored problems, often the most important ones, instead solving less pressing problems that were easier to express in their language. The government is almost entirely constituted by the so-called mestiza middle class, or more accurately, white passing and urban, and they do what they can, but with the imperative limitations of not knowing the territory, and with their ambitions of completing the process of becoming white. The technocracy is impatient. It needs quick results to fill in the numbers in the spreadsheet, so it can say whether a project was implemented or not, to guarantee votes, and so on. This idea of a mixed public communal model always tended more towards an inefficient statism and less towards the communal. It gradually disempowered the peasant organizations and the families, and this opened the way for state management that enabled networks of corruption controlled by old and new capitalists, but in the hands of the state rather than in the historical rich families of the area. The greater the autonomy and the popular control that was achieved, in terms of organization and evaluation defined from within the territory, the greater the sustainability they have demonstrated in the long term, even under the immense pressures of an international blockade and a pandemic." Unquote. Ecological revolution, the best strategy in success or failure. Transforming the solutions we project also means transforming our understanding of the kinds of methods that will get us there. Quote, "Today all belong to the ruling class who look at their own lives from above." Unquote. The anarchist essay, 23 Theses Concerning Revolt, elaborates this idea of an embodied strategy. Quote, "All military strategy is to impose an ideal plan on the map that represents reality. If we do not intend to make a military campaign, we must refuse to see the revolution as something organized according to a unified plan, as if it were a game of Risk. We are not looking down from above, giving orders. We are here, in the midst of a beautiful chaos that our enemies will always try to organize. We will be stronger than ever if we learn to triumph in this chaos, to move in the network of our own relationships, to communicate horizontally or circularly, to use only what really is ours, and to influence others, to understand that not everyone is going to act as we act. That is the beauty of rebellion, and our effectiveness in it does not lie in making the whole world equal, but devising the best way to relate in a complementary way to those who are different and follow different paths." Unquote. The paradigm shift in our concept of revolution dovetails with the paradigm shift in our relationship with the planet and its inhabitants. We need to perceive an ecosystem of revolt in which, instead of trying to control what everyone is doing, promote the right ideas and suppress the wrong ideas. We understand that our niche is to create relationships of reciprocity with those around us, making us all stronger and healthier rather than making us all the same. It is such an ecosystem that is most able to combine collective knowledge and local, situated knowledge, allowing the decentralization of intelligence rather than the continued reliance on the experts and leaders who have brought us into this crisis. A part of this approach means accepting that we will never convince everyone. Others will continue to fight in legal channels, seeking limited reform or government funding. There can still be instances of synergy, even with those who remain in such a diametrically opposed paradigm. On one hand, we can take advantage of resources intended for other uses, such as the people in the small town in the U.S. planting thousands of trees subsidized by the state. In other cases, we might get to know sympathetic bureaucrats or academics who are able to pass resources to our projects and support our struggles, as with a couple of academics who supported this book, or the radical academic from Borneo who uses their research to support indigenous communities in struggle. Every alliance should be evaluated on whether it helps us or hinders us from building the kind of decentralized communal power that we need. Rejecting technocratic unity or party dogmatism in our movements does not mean embracing an acritical relativism in which all ideas are equally valid. It is not an ecosystem of revolt if there is no revolt. One of the most important tasks today, which we must spread as energetically as we can, is to develop revolutionary horizons with as many people and communities as possible, precisely because the state, with all its appendages, has spent so many decades extinguishing even the thought of revolution. Revolutionary movements come with several key advantages. Only by fighting for revolutionary transformations that present an existential threat to the existing order, for example, a world without rich people, without police, without governors, without corporations, have we ever achieved important concessions. All of the labor laws, paid vacations, limited working days, rent controls, public health care, unemployment benefits, and safety regulations that are being chipped away year by year are the vestiges of reforms won by revolutionary movements of anarchists and communists in the first part of the 20th century. or since then by organizations arising from those movements and institutionalized as a way to pacify them. In other words, when we fight for revolution, we win even when we lose. We cannot, however, view revolutionary movements as simply a bargaining chip. As long as the power to organize our lives is alienated from us and concentrated in the institutions that rule us, any improvement we are granted will be steadily worn away, starting the moment we no longer present a threat. Revolutionary movements, taking direct action to destroy what destroys us, raise consciousness and force all of society to talk about problems the media and government had caused us to ignore. When we meet in the streets in the heat of rebellion, we place all our isolated problems in common and realize how much we share. Whether you are looking at fracking rigs in Pennsylvania or wind parks in Oaxaca, big businesses and the governments that support them operate in a cloak of secrecy, isolating people and getting them to sign away their lands one by one. When people fight back, such as when they built a barricade to stop armed detachments from erecting wind turbines in Bijoxo, Oaxaca, they created space to question these projects. And even though that particular wind project was constructed thanks to a complex counterinsurgency campaign that deployed all kinds of mercenaries, from paid assassins and neighborhood snitches to marketing strategists, NGO workers, and academics, battle lines were drawn that continued to facilitate resistance in the rest of the region, while the people who nominally lost this conflict were able to negotiate better conditions. In the United States, for over 40 years, the dominant narrative was that the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s had ended systemic racism. It is only when multiracial, black-led crowds fought police and smashed wealthy businesses in Oakland after the police murder of Oscar Grant in 2009, and when they did the same on a much larger scale after the police murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, that white supremacy became the subject of public conversation. This was thanks to a completely acephalous movement that came alive through many other revolts of varying size across the country, and that blended spaces of conversation, spaces of healing, spaces of occupation and transformation, and spaces of counterattack, vengeance, and wealth distribution. Significantly, most of the mainstream media that kept systemic racism going strong by serving as the propaganda arm for the war on drugs and avoiding serious reporting on any other facets of white supremacy, by 2014, were forced to acknowledge that racism was still a problem. And as uncomfortable as it is for those who would turn the movement into a lucrative NGO that refuses to support its prisoners, or into a democratic voting machine, in 2020, that movement manifested again in a huge way and forced all of society, at least for several months, to consider a very radical idea that just a few years earlier would have been inconceivable at that scale: abolishing the police entirely. And the most eloquent opening gesture to that debate was to manifest the idea of abolishing the police by burning the 3rd Precinct police station of Minneapolis down to the ground. Similar to the Arab Spring in 2011, the revolt in Minneapolis sent shockwaves across the world, advancing conversations about racism and spreading tactics of collective self-defense against the police in the UK, France, Brazil, and beyond. The ability of movements with revolutionary horizons to raise consciousness and shift the limits of the debate is beyond question, but it is also fully wrapped up in another important concern: shifting the balance of power. In the US especially, the police are a central institution. Abolishing them means abolishing the US in its entirety as a capitalist settler state. It was unavoidable that anyone unable to conceive of such a revolutionary horizon would gradually replace abolishing the police with defunding the police, and from there many of them would move on to support increased police funding in order to pay for the cameras or improved sensitivity training that would supposedly put an end to hundreds of years of history. If we do not have the power to abolish such a huge, ugly machine as the US and replace it with something better, healthier, very few of us have the power to imagine abolishing its component parts. Likewise, if we do not have the power to take over our territory, feed ourselves through ecocentric relations, and abolish ecocidal industries, few of us will have the power to imagine any solution that does not involve the government coming in and waving a magic wand. Having a revolutionary horizon requires us to build power, a revolutionary kind of power that corresponds to our own needs and ways of living. Fortunately, revolutionary movements are uniquely suited to building decentralized power. In contrast, reformist movements only strengthen centralized power, both by solidifying the authority's role as arbiter and by funneling massive amounts of resources away from social movements for the purpose of lobbying. Envisioning revolutionary horizons and building power out of our own activity and the collective satisfaction of our own needs and desires, the kind of power that cannot prop up a new oppressive system, inevitably reveals all the intersecting lines of oppression and resistance. This is the terrain in which we see how climate change, industrial pollution, patriarchy, borders, white supremacy, mass extinction, accumulation by dispossession, and colonialism are inextricable. By definition, this kind of revolution means changing the paradigm. In a society in which even environmentalism has become a tool for ravaging the earth and its inhabitants, smashing the dominant paradigm is a necessity we can no longer elide. That is why we need to fight for a revolution, and to try our hardest to win. Putting an end to a system that by its very nature produces misery would be the best future for all of us. If we fight in a way that is consistent with the world that we want to defend, then every step we take, even if we don't make it all the way, leaves the world a better place and could make the difference between life and death for a person, a community, an ecosystem that right now is under threat. Recognizing that we live only thanks to a beautiful web of relationships with countless other beings, nurturing those relationships is the best possible way to live. It is a revolution that transforms our present, honors our past, and offers the best hope for ending an apocalypse that has been going on for too long, moving forwards to a future where we can all, finally, begin to heal.